Hi, I'm Fabrice Harari. In this course, I'm going to talk about how you can use the APIs and specifically the Windows APIs to do things that are not natively possible in WinDev. So it's going to be a little technical, but once again, we're going to go step by step, and you're going to see that it's not that big of a deal, and you'll be able to use this kind of tools very soon in your own project. What does API mean? Well, API stands for Application Programming Interface. It means that it's anything and everything that can be used to interface with an application. So it is basically a set of routines, data structure, object classes, protocols, anything that you can use to connect to something else. So when you talk about an API, basically you're talking about the description of a way to connect to something else. And in that sense, when it's also true that you have an API with ActiveX, Holiday Automation, and all this kind of thing, you have a way to interface with another application. So API is a very generic term. An API is provided under the format of libraries or operating system services in order to support the building of application. Basically, you're doing something and you want people to build something else around your application, and that can be at any level. An API can be linked to an operating system. It's the case of the Windows API, but it also can be specific to a particular specific program or website. By example, Google is providing several API for Google Maps, Google Earth, and so on. It can be DirectX is an API. It's used to interface with the graphic cards. You have an API to develop on the iPhone. You have an API provided by PayPal on the web too. So all that are in fact really ways to interface with something that already exists. So of course, it is perfectly possible that you provide an API for your software under one way or another. One way of doing that would be, by example, to provide .NET assembly, giving access points to several functions of your programs. It's perfectly possible. It's a safe way to give access to your database, by example. You want to let other developer develop function based on the database of your software, but you don't want to give them access directly to the data. Well, that's a very good way to do that. You can decide exactly what control you set and how. So you can create your own API for your software. But here in this course, we are going to talk specifically about Windows API and how you can use that in your WinDev program to call functions of the system and get information, change things, do lots of things with direct access to the operating system. We're going to now look in detail on how you call Windows API in WinDev. The same thing can be done, of course, in WebDev in server code, and clearly that's something that can be used in many different places. Be very careful, of course, if you try to do this kind of thing in WebDev, your server may not agree with you calling directly system functions, so be careful. But mostly in WinDev you're going to call API from time to time. So the first thing to do, of course, is to read the help. The keyword to find all the help you need about that is API. There is no reason why you should start using any type of new function in WinDev without first reading each and every page of the help concerning that function. It will really a good investment of your time, because there are lots of interesting information available in the help. So I cannot stress that enough. Read the help. And it's not because you follow this course that you are authorized not to read the help. On the contrary, I'm giving you lots of information here, but there's no way I can give you each and every line that is in the help. So please, even if you follow this course, read the help. It will help you tremendously. So this is the syntax for calling an API. The function is API. Then the different parameters are, first, the name of the DLL that you're going to use. In this case, it's a system DLL. The second parameter is the name of the function that you're calling inside the DLL. Of course, that depends on the DLL. And then the parameters after that depends on the function itself. In this case, it will be the handle of a window, and so on and so forth. Well, of course, only the two first parameters are fixed. After that, you can have a variable number of parameters. It depends on the library, the DLL, and the function. Same thing, the type of each parameter depends on the library and the function. And of course, the API function returns a result, and the type of the result, the type of variable in which you should get that result, depends also on the function. So you need to find information on the DLL that you're calling, on the function that you're calling, in order to know what to do with it. There's no way that WinDev is going to tell you all that by itself. The parameter type, for each parameter, the parameter can be, that's the type that are supported by the system. So it can be integer, any size of integer, but for all pointers and addresses is going to be a system integer. So most of the time that's the right choice. It can be real, boolean, string, string on, but that's quite rare. Most of the time it's going to be the address of a string. So how do you pass the address of a string variable? Well, let's say that your string variable is called smyString. The address of this string is ampersand smyString. So if you need the address of a string, that's what you're going to pass. When you are getting a string from an API as a result, and because you can have parameters that are both in and out, it's sometimes not possible in advance to know the length of the string and that you should reserve to get the value. So there is a function to solve that problem called string retrieve, and I invite you to read the help about string retrieve in the help file in order to know how to use it when you encounter that problem. You can also pass a structure's address. You will never pass a structure itself, because a structure can contain anything and anywhere. It would be a nightmare. So it's always the address of a structure that is passed. And that's happening quite often in API that are a little complex. It's structures. The structure can contain strings, but or any other type of variable that we talked about earlier, but preferably the structure are going to contain the addresses of the strings. So again, you need to put the address of the string inside your structure. In that case, the element of your structure is going to be a system integer, and inside the system integer in your structure you're going to put ampersand smyString. And of course you can also have callback procedure names. What is that? Well, that is the name of a WinDev procedure that you send as a parameter to the API function, in order for this API function to be able to call your own procedure when something happens. So that's something that is extremely powerful, of course, and that you can do with this syntax. Now, as I was saying earlier, the API function is going to send you a result. That result can be the information that you were expecting. of course, but it can be also a flag saying success or failure. And if you receive a flag, that depends of the API itself, on the DLL and the function. You will have to find out what it's sending back, of course. But if it's sending back a flag saying that there was an error, then you can use the error info function in wlanguage to find out what the error is and deal with it. So you need the error system code or error system message constant for that. Now, one thing that you need to realize is that you need to call that function immediately after the API call, because the API system is keeping only the last error, and each call to the API is going to reset this error. So either you do another API call, or you call a function inside your system that is itself calling the system and resetting that information. So in both cases you would lose the information. So the first thing that you should do is always do, okay, my result equal API this, that, the other. If my result equal error, then error info. Immediately, no waiting. Now there is also another function that is interesting. It's called API parameter, and it allows backward compatibility with the way the system was working in WinDev 10 and before. So it allows you to work with the new system or the old system. What are the different options? But basically it's how the threads are managed, because before WinDev 10 the threads were blocked while an API call was made, because most of the API call were considered to be mono-thread, which is not the case anymore by default. And regional system settings. The system settings are now automatically restored to their original value when an API call is modifying them. If you want them to stay the way your API call has modified them, then you need to change the default settings here. That's really details, but you need to know that this exists in order for you to identify the problem when you encounter it. Now, it would be too simple if that was the only thing. There are in fact now 4 different syntaxes. Originally there was only one syntax, but clearly there were requests for other way of doing things, and there are now 4 different syntaxes for the API function. You can call the API function for a DLL, so the first parameter is the DLL, with a function name. That's the example that I showed you here, send message A. With a function number instead of the function name, that's a different case, or with the function address. Now, when would you do any of this? Well, when the documentation of your API is telling you to use the function number or the function address. By default, use the function name. That's the most common case, but if the documentation calls for something else, it's available here. Now the fourth syntax is to use an API description variable, and that's a whole other question that we're going to look at now. So what is an API description variable? Well, it is an advanced type of variable that you can declare in your source the same way that you declare any type of variable. It's an advanced type. So how do you declare it? Well, you do something like this: my API description is API description. At that point it's just like is string, is this, is that. It's API description. Now the next step is a little more strange. It's because it is an advanced type of variable. So the next step is to set the properties of your variable. Instead of putting just a value in it, you're going to set different properties, and these properties can be And I'm saying can be because they are not all used all the time. Some of them are exclusive, and this is one of them. Address, that's when you're calling your API function by address. Of course, if you don't call it by address, you don't put any value in it. If you do put an address in it, it will automatically set the other properties that are not the address, the function name and so on, at the corresponding value. So you just set the properties that you need for your call. The other one are set automatically. Calling convention. So that's a new thing in WinDev 18, and it's one of the reasons why you should always read the help. It's because not only you don't know some things, not only you forget some things, but also things continuously evolve with WinDev. There are more and more options, more and more syntaxes. It's becoming more and more powerful. So if you don't look at the help, you don't know that the new options are available. So that's something that is new in WinDev 18 and 18, and that you will probably never use. What is that? Well, it's something that you will find in your API function documentation. It will tell you that this function needs to be called this way or that way. Basically, what does that mean? It means that it's the cleaning of the stack and memory that is done by either the caller or the callee, and because you don't want to have a memory leak, you're going from time to time to need to set this property. By default, don't set it. It will use the default value, and most of the time it will work. Now the DLL name, if you're not calling your function by address in memory, then you need to set the DLL name the same way that we were setting the DLL name as the first parameter of the API syntax. It's really matching the other syntax. The function name, same thing. If you're calling your DLL the same way than before with the function name, that's where you put it. The number, that's when you're calling a DLL by its name, but with the number of the function instead of the DLL. Again, it depends of what you're calling. And of course, if you put a value in number, it will automatically set function name to nothing. It's one or the other, and that is managed automatically for you in order to avoid problems. Now there is a option. It's about the same thing as the API parameter function that we are talking about. It allows you to set option about the threads, are they blocking or not, to automatically free the DLL after the call, and to restore the system settings about your call. So that's the same thing than the API parameter. It's directly inside the variable. And then we have the description of the type for each parameter of your call. So you remember in the previous example we had 4 parameters for this function. Now for each of those parameters you should have a line saying parameter of one type equal, okay, this one is a system integer, this one is a string, this one is this one is that. So you should have one line per parameter with this syntax. Then you need also to set the return type. It's going to be the type as set inside your return variable. That doesn't preclude you from creating a variable of the correct type to put the result in it, of course. That just, you need to set all that inside your description. Now once all that is set, you can call your API, and to do that you have 2 different choices. The first choice is to use the API function that we saw previously with its 4th syntax, in which the first parameter, instead of being a DLL name, is going to be the my API description. My API description already contains the DLL name, the function name, the address, all the things that you had before, so you don't need anything else. And then after the my API description, you would have as many parameters values as this function need, because with the dot dot parameter at dot dot type, you are just setting the type of the parameter, not the content. The content is in the call. So that would be the API function. And the other way of doing that is directly by calling the API description itself. And you would do that with the syntax my result equal my API description param1, param2, and so on and so forth. So directly you have created, by doing this API description thing, you have, it's a variable, but you call it like a procedure. It's a little strange at the beginning, but well, it works, no problem. So as you can see, things have changed a lot. For those of you who were already using API call with the old syntax, there are new things, new stuff, more powerful. Always read the help. It's the only way. Now let's go a little further. We need to talk about the case of complex calls, and let me explain. When you're calling an API, whatever it is, with the API function, the API function is going to load the DLL in memory for you and unload it once the API call is done. That is true for all DLLs except a few DLLs of the system that are always in memory and available. But most of the time you're going to load the DLL from the disk, use part of it, then unload it. Of course, this takes time. Now, when you need to chain calls to one DLL, you have several calls to made one after the other. Well, by example, one call is going to initialize the system, the next one is going to start the work, the second one is going to use the result of the second, and so on and so forth. Well, clearly you need to keep the DLL loaded in memory, because otherwise you're doing the initialization in your first call, the DLL is unloaded from memory. When you try to start the work, the DLL is not initialized, and you have a good error message saying system not initialized or something similar. Well, that comes from the fact that your DLL is not in memory available. So to keep the DLL loaded in memory, you do it this way with the load DLL function with the DLL name, and you put the resulting handle in a variable. Then you do all your call with the API function, and then you do a free DLL of the DLL handle to unload it. So that is, of course, going to help you tremendously when you're doing some complex things that need the DLL to be there and maintain really a status of what's going on. It may also be very important when you don't need the result of one function to call the next one, but you need speed. If you're in a loop and inside that loop that you're doing 1 million times, you're doing an API call, then it's much better to load the DLL before the loop, do your API call inside the loop, and unload the DLL after the loop, than to have 1 million times the DLL loaded from disk in memory, then unloaded. That would be clearly a huge waste of time. Now, that is true about the API call. It is not working the same way with the new API description. And to find that information, you need to read the help. And worse than that, you need to read the whole help, because this is written in the notes at the very end of the page of the API description. If you don't go to the end, then you won't know that the memory management is done completely differently with the new system. So what's different? Well, first, of course, the first thing is kind of obvious. You need one description, one variable per function of the DLL. It's not one variable for each DLL, it's one description per function. If you're calling several functions, then declare several variables. Otherwise, reusing the same one is going to be a huge waste of time. But once that is done, the DLL is loaded only once, not for each variable. So if you have 5 different calls to make, you create 5 different variables, and the DLL will be loaded only once. So it's great, it simplifies things, but once again, it's a black box. Once you start using that, you don't know anymore when the DLL is loaded and when it is unloaded. It's the system doing it for you, which means that in some case, in case of optimization or things like that, it may be better to stick with the old system where you do it yourself. But this is supposed to help people not forget to load the DLL and all these kind of things. So I guess it's an improvement in some aspect. Now, something a little different in some calls. Also, you will need to be able to send your the system handle of your application to the other function, to the API. And to do that, there is a specific function also called instance. It's going to return the instance of your application, the system handle of your application, and you can send that to the function, external function of the API that is needing it to do something about it. So that's about it for the complex call. We are next going to talk about the different problems that you will encounter when you work with APIs. What problems are you going to find when you start using API? Well, the first one clearly is which API to call. You need to do something and you need to find which API or series of APIs you need to call. Well, clearly that is not a WinDev problem. It's something that you have to find out for yourself, and the best way to do that is to ask on an API forum, not on a WinDev forum. You will have much more answer this way. Of course, you can also search directly on MSDN. They have a list of functions by categories. And this is the URL, last time I checked, of the page in question, the starting point for the function by category. Of course, there is also a very good starting point is to do a search on Google API, and what you're trying to do, there's a good chance that you'll find after a few search people talking about what you're trying to achieve. Now, that's once you know which API to call, the problems are going to be the following, and that's a given. We all get through those. It's perfectly normal. You will have incorrect parameter type. That's a problem that you'll get all the time. You'll miss something. You will also get errors because you're sending a value instead of an address. You will make mistake in managing your strings. You will have problem with the structure, and you will not know what the constant values are. That's typical API problem. And for all these problems, the first answer, the first starting point is WD API. WD API is a utility that is coming with WinDev and that you can use to work on that.